She stood at the altar in a $50,000 designer gown, looking into the eyes of the man everyone said she shouldn't marry. But when Margaret Whitmore opened her mouth to speak her vows, the words that came out weren't about love or devotion. They were a secret so shocking, it would expose a truth that had been buried for 23 years. This is the story of a 58-year-old widow who inherited $200 million, and the family doctor who treated her dying husband for 2 years. What happened between them will challenge everything you think you know about grief, guilt, and second chances. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Margaret wasn't just marrying her late husband's doctor. She was marrying the man her husband had secretly asked to take care of her. The man who held a letter written by her dying husband, containing instructions that would either heal a broken family or destroy it forever. I'm going to tell you this story in 3 parts. First, the final days of Richard Whitmore, one of America's richest men, and the impossible request he made to his doctor. Second, the year of forbidden feelings that nearly tore 2 good people apart. And finally, the wedding day revelation that left 300 guests in tears and changed 3 generations of a family forever. But before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered if it's possible to honor the dead by living for the living? Keep that question close, because Margaret and Dr. James Harrison are about to find out. Let's begin. Before we start this incredible story, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and let us know where you're watching from around the world. Richard Whitmore built his empire from nothing. Steel mills, real estate, tech investments. By age 62, he was worth more than most small countries. But money couldn't buy him the one thing he needed most: time. When Dr. James Harrison delivered the diagnosis, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, maybe 6 months, Richard didn't ask about treatments or second opinions. He asked one question that would haunt the doctor for years: will you help me protect the people I love from what's coming? See, Richard Whitmore wasn't your typical billionaire. He'd grown up dirt poor in Ohio, worked his way through college, and never forgot what it felt like to have nothing. When he met Margaret 25 years earlier, she was a young teacher from a small town, and he was just starting to make his first million. She didn't marry him for his money. Hell, she barely knew he had any. Their love story was the kind you read about in books. He'd drive 3 hours every weekend just to take her to dinner at the local diner. She'd grade papers while he worked on business deals at her kitchen table. When he proposed, it was with a ring that cost him his entire savings at the time, $800. She said yes before he even finished asking. But money changes things, even when you don't want it to. As Richard's wealth grew, so did the walls around their life. Private security, gated communities, friends who might not be friends at all. Margaret handled it better than most, but Richard could see the loneliness in her eyes sometimes. The way she'd light up when they'd sneak away for a simple walk in the park, just the 2 of them. They'd tried to have children, spent years and thousands of dollars on treatments that never worked. The doctors couldn't explain why. Everything looked perfect on paper. Margaret threw herself into her charity work, and Richard buried himself in business. They were happy, but there was always this shadow of what might have been. Now, sitting in Dr. Harrison's office, Richard felt that familiar protective instinct kick in. He'd spent 25 years building walls around Margaret to keep her safe. But how do you protect someone from the pain of losing you? Dr. James Harrison had been practicing oncology for 15 years. He'd delivered hundreds of terminal diagnoses, held countless hands, and learned to compartmentalize his emotions. But something about Richard Whitmore was different. Maybe it was the way he immediately started asking about his wife's well-being instead of his own prognosis. Maybe it was the calm acceptance in his eyes, like he'd already made peace with his fate. "Mr. Whitmore," James said carefully, "I understand your concern for your wife, but right now we need to focus on your treatment options. There are experimental trials, aggressive chemotherapy protocols." Richard held up a hand. "Doctor, I've built 3 companies from nothing. I know how to read between the lines. 6 months, maybe less, right?" James nodded reluctantly. "Then here's what I need from you. I need you to help me make sure Margaret doesn't spend those 6 months watching me die. I need you to help me make sure she doesn't spend the rest of her life alone. But Richard Whitmore had a secret that even his wife didn't know. 4 months, he'd been making arrangements, not just for his business empire or his fortune. He'd been orchestrating something far more personal. Something that would ensure Margaret would never be alone. And the centerpiece of his plan was a man he barely knew but trusted completely. Dr. James Harrison had no idea he was about to become part of the most elaborate act of love, or manipulation, in the Whitmore family history. Dr. James Harrison was 45, recently divorced, and had dedicated his life to helping terminal patients die with dignity. He'd seen hundreds of families struggle with loss, but the Whitmores were different. Richard faced death like a chess master planning his final game. James's own story wasn't exactly a fairy tale. He'd married his college sweetheart right out of medical school, worked 80-hour weeks through his residency, and slowly watched his marriage crumble under the weight of his dedication to his patients. His ex-wife used to joke that he cared more about dying strangers than his own family. Turns out, it wasn't much of a joke. The divorce had been finalized 6 months before he met the Whitmores. No kids, just a division of assets and 2 people who'd grown into strangers. James threw himself even deeper into his work, finding purpose in helping families navigate the impossible terrain of terminal illness. When Richard first walked into his office, James saw something he rarely encountered, a man who wasn't angry at his diagnosis. Most patients went through the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Richard seemed to skip straight to acceptance and then move on to something else entirely. Planning. "Doctor," Richard said during their second appointment, "I want to show you something." He pulled out his phone and showed James a photo. Margaret, laughing at something off camera, her face lit up with genuine joy. She was beautiful, but it wasn't the kind of beauty that came from expensive treatments or designer clothes. It was the kind that came from the inside. "That picture was taken last month at a charity gala," Richard continued. "Look at her eyes. Really look." James studied the photo. Margaret's smile was radiant, but there was something in her eyes, a sadness that didn't match her expression. "She's been like this for 2 years," Richard said quietly. "Ever since we found out I was sick. She's trying so hard to be strong for me that she's forgotten how to be herself. And after I'm gone." He shook his head. "She's going to blame herself for every moment she wasn't happy while I was dying." James had seen this before. Spouses who felt guilty for experiencing any joy while their partner was terminal. It was natural, but it was also destructive. "Have you talked to her about this?" James asked. "How do you tell the woman you love that you're worried about her being too sad about losing you?" Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She'd just try harder to pretend everything's fine." Over the next few weeks, James found himself thinking about the Whitmores more than was probably healthy. Richard came in twice a week for treatments that were buying him time but not hope. Margaret came with him to every appointment, always perfectly put together, always asking the right questions, always maintaining that smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. James started to notice things about Margaret that he probably shouldn't have been noticing. The way she'd unconsciously hold her breath when he delivered test results. How she'd grip Richard's hand a little tighter whenever James mentioned pain management. The way she'd brighten up when James would crack a joke or share a story about another patient who'd beaten the odds. She was intelligent, asking questions that showed she'd been researching Richard's condition extensively. She was compassionate, always asking about James's other patients and whether there was anything she could do to help. And she was lonely in a way that went deeper than just facing her husband's illness. "Doctor," Richard said during one appointment when Margaret had stepped out to make a phone call, "I have a proposition for you." James looked up from Richard's chart. "I'm listening. I want you to be Margaret's friend." The request was so simple and so complicated at the same time. James stared at Richard, trying to figure out if he'd heard correctly. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't think that's appropriate," Richard finished. "I know it's not. But here's the thing, Margaret hasn't had a real friend in years. Our lifestyle, my business, the security concerns, It's isolated her. She has people she knows, people she works with on charity stuff, but no one she can just be herself with. James felt a knot forming in his stomach. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to give her someone to talk to. Someone who understands what we're going through but isn't drowning in it like she is. Someone who can remind her that life exists outside of this hospital. 3 months into Richard's treatment, something shifted. Margaret, who had been strong through everything, began to crumble. And Richard made a request that crossed every professional boundary James had ever maintained. He asked James to spend time with Margaret. Not as her doctor, but as her friend. What Richard didn't say was that he'd been watching them together, and he'd seen something that gave him hope, and broke his heart. It started innocently. Coffee after Richard's appointments. Walks in the hospital garden while Richard rested. Conversations about books, travel, life beyond the shadow of terminal illness. But somewhere between Margaret's laughter returning and James forgetting to maintain professional distance, something beautiful and terrible began to bloom. The first coffee happened by accident. Margaret was waiting for Richard to finish a procedure that was running long, and James found her in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "Mrs. Whitmore? Everything okay?" She looked up, and for the first time since he'd known her, the mask slipped. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked exhausted. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, wiping her eyes. "I don't know why it's just been a long day." James sat down across from her. "You know, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never met a spouse who didn't have days like this. The strong ones like you hold it together for months, and then one day something small happens and it all comes crashing down." Margaret laughed, but it was shaky. "Richard wanted me to pick up his prescription, and the pharmacist asked if I needed help with anything else. Such a simple question, but I couldn't answer it. I stood there for 5 minutes trying to figure out what I needed help with, and I realized I don't even know anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've become so focused on taking care of Richard that I've forgotten how to take care of myself. I can't remember the last time I read a book that wasn't about cancer. I can't remember the last time I had a conversation that wasn't about symptoms or treatments or how I'm feeling about everything." James nodded. "That's normal. But it's also not sustainable." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "But I don't know how to do anything else right now. I don't know how to be anything other than Richard's wife who's dealing with his cancer." "What were you before?" James asked. The question seemed to surprise her. "Before? Before you were Richard's wife? Before cancer? Who were you?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I was a teacher. 5th grade. I loved it. The kids, the challenge of making complex things simple, the moment when you could see understanding dawn in a child's eyes. I gave it up when Richard's business started taking off and we were traveling so much. I always thought I'd go back to it someday." "What else?" "I used to paint. Watercolors, mostly landscapes. I was never very good, but I enjoyed it. And I used to volunteer at the animal shelter. I loved working with the dogs that had been abandoned or abused, helping them learn to trust again." She smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "I guess I was just myself." "You're still yourself," James said gently. "You're just going through something that would challenge anyone's sense of identity." "Richard keeps telling me I need to have a life outside of his illness," Margaret said. "But I don't know how to do that without feeling like I'm abandoning him. What if having a life outside his illness was actually the best thing you could do for him?" Margaret looked at him questioningly. "Think about it," James continued. "What does Richard love most about you?" "I don't know. My amazing cooking skills." She laughed, and it was more genuine this time. "He loves your joy," James said. "He loves the way you light up when you're passionate about something. He loves the woman who used to teach 5th grade and paint watercolors and rescue abandoned dogs. And right now, he's watching that woman disappear, and he's blaming himself for it. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but they were different tears. I never thought about it like that. Maybe the most loving thing you can do for Richard is to stay connected to who you are. Maybe the best way to honor your marriage is to make sure there's still a you left when, afterward. That conversation led to another, and another. James found himself looking forward to these moments with Margaret in a way that made him uncomfortable. She was intelligent and funny and kind, and underneath all the pain, she had a strength that was remarkable. They started taking walks in the hospital garden while Richard had his treatments. Margaret would tell him about the charity work she was doing, and James would share stories about his other patients, carefully anonymized, of course. She had a way of asking questions that made him think about his work differently, and he found himself opening up about his own struggles with his divorce, his dedication to his patients, his sometimes overwhelming sense of responsibility for their families. You know, Margaret said during one of their walks, Richard was right about you. What do you mean? He said you were different from other doctors. He said you actually cared about the whole person, not just the disease. James felt heat rise in his cheeks. Your husband is an exceptional man. He is, Margaret agreed. And he's lucky to have you as his doctor. But as the weeks passed, James began to realize that his feelings for Margaret were becoming complicated. He told himself it was natural, she was going through something traumatic, and he was her support system. But late at night, he'd catch himself thinking about her laugh, or the way she'd tuck a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, or the passion in her voice when she talked about something she cared about. The worst part was that he could see Richard watching them. Not suspiciously, but with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Like he was pleased that Margaret was smiling again, that she was engaging with life instead of just enduring it. One afternoon, as James was finishing up Richard's treatment, Richard said something that made James's blood run cold. She's falling in love with you, you know. James nearly dropped the 4-bag he was adjusting. Mr. Whitmore, I don't think. It's okay, Richard said calmly. I want her to. James stared at him. What? Doctor, I'm going to be dead in 3 months. Maybe less. Margaret is 58 years old, and if I have my way, she's going to live for another 30 years. I can't bear the thought of her spending those 30 years alone, grieving for me. Mr. Whitmore, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Margaret and I are friends. That's all. Richard smiled. I know what I see. And I know my wife. She hasn't laughed like she's been laughing lately in over 2 years. She hasn't been excited about anything in months. You're giving her something to live for. This is inappropriate, James said, but his voice lacked conviction. What's inappropriate, Richard said, is a good man denying himself happiness because of some arbitrary rule about professional boundaries. What's inappropriate is my wife dying inside while I'm dying outside. James felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to let yourself feel what you're already feeling. I'm asking you to be there for her when I can't be. And I'm asking you to consider that maybe this isn't a coincidence. What do you mean? Richard looked at him for a long moment. I mean, maybe you're exactly who she needs, and maybe she's exactly who you need, and maybe I'm the luckiest man alive because I get to see it happen. What Margaret and James didn't know was that Richard was documenting everything. Every conversation, every shared glance, every moment of connection. But he wasn't gathering evidence of betrayal. He was collecting proof of something else entirely, that his plan was working. That the woman he'd loved for 25 years might have a chance at happiness after he was gone. But Richard's plan had a flaw he never anticipated. Because real love can't be orchestrated, and the feelings growing between Margaret and James were about to spiral beyond anyone's control. As Richard's condition worsened, the boundaries began to blur. James found himself staying longer, caring deeper, becoming not just a doctor but a pillar of strength for the entire family. And Margaret began to depend on him in ways that terrified her. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Richard's treatments became more frequent as his body started to reject the medications that had been keeping him stable. He was spending more time in the hospital, which meant Margaret was spending more time there too. And James found himself rearranging his schedule to be available whenever they needed him. It wasn't professional anymore, and they all knew it. James would sit with Margaret in the waiting room during Richard's procedures, not because he was required to, but because he couldn't bear the thought of her being alone. Margaret would bring James coffee in the mornings, not because she was being polite, but because she'd learned that he rarely remembered to eat or drink during long days. The other staff noticed. James caught his colleagues exchanging glances when he'd spend an extra hour with the Whitmores. His nurse, Sarah, pulled him aside one day. "Dr. Harrison, are you okay? You seem different lately." "Different how?" "You're distracted. And you're spending a lot of time with the Whitmore family." James felt defensive. Mr. Whitmore is a complex case. He needs additional attention. Sarah gave him a look that said she wasn't buying it. "It's Mrs. Whitmore you're giving the additional attention to." James wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. Because Sarah was right. He was giving Margaret additional attention, and it had nothing to do with her husband's medical needs. The truth was, James had never felt this way about anyone. Not even his ex-wife, whom he'd married young and divorced out of mutual indifference. What he felt for Margaret was different, deeper, more complex, more consuming. He found himself thinking about her when he wasn't with her, worrying about how she was handling things, anticipating their conversations. And Margaret was struggling with her own feelings. She'd catch herself looking forward to seeing James more than she should. She'd find excuses to stay at the hospital longer, to grab coffee with him, to walk with him in the garden. She felt guilty about it, but she also felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she confided to James one evening as they sat in the hospital chapel. Richard was sleeping, and Margaret had needed a quiet place to think. "What do you mean?" "I feel like I'm betraying Richard by being happy. By looking forward to things. By..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "By what?" Margaret looked at him, and James saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. "By having feelings for you." The words hung in the air between them like a confession and an accusation. James felt his chest tighten. "Margaret, I know it's wrong," she said quickly. "I know it's terrible. My husband is dying, and I'm developing feelings for another man. What kind of person does that make me?" James wanted to tell her it made her human. He wanted to tell her that he was falling in love with her too, that he'd never felt this way about anyone, that he thought about her constantly. But he also knew that Richard was lying in a hospital bed 50 feet away, trusting them both. "It makes you someone who's going through something impossible," he said finally. "It makes you someone who's trying to figure out how to keep living while watching the person you love die. But it's not fair to Richard. It's not fair to you. And it's not fair to me, because I don't know how to handle these feelings." James took her hand, and the simple touch sent electricity through both of them. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you." "What?" "Richard knows." Margaret's eyes widened. "What do you mean, he knows?" "He knows about your feelings. He knows about mine. And he's okay with it." "That's impossible. He told me he wants you to be happy. He said he can't bear the thought of you spending the rest of your life alone, grieving for him." Margaret stared at him. "He said that. He said more than that. He said he thinks we're good for each other. He said he's grateful that you have someone to lean on." Margaret pulled her hand away. "I don't understand. How can he be okay with this?" "Because he loves you more than his own jealousy. Because he's dying, and he wants to know that you're going to be okay when he's gone." Margaret started crying, not the careful, controlled tears she'd been shedding for months, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal. "It's not supposed to be like this," she cried. "I'm supposed to be focused on him. I'm supposed to be devoted and faithful and thinking only about making whatever time he has left as good as possible." James moved closer to her, wanting to comfort her but unsure if he should. Margaret, being human doesn't make you unfaithful. Having feelings doesn't make you a bad wife. But falling in love with someone else while your husband is dying does. The words hit James like a physical blow, because they were true and because they were exactly what he'd been thinking about his own feelings. "Is that what's happening?" he asked quietly. "Are you falling in love with me?" Margaret looked at him through her tears. "I think I already have." Then came the night that changed everything. Richard called James to his bedside at 2 a.m., not because he was dying, but because he was ready to reveal the truth about his master plan. What he told James that night would force the doctor to make an impossible choice: honor his dying patient's wishes, or follow his own moral code. Richard handed James a sealed envelope with instructions not to open it until after the funeral. Inside was a letter that would explain everything: why Richard had pushed them together, what he wanted for Margaret's future, and the one condition that would make James question everything he thought he knew about love and loyalty. The call came at 2:17 a.m. James was used to middle-of-the-night calls. They were part of the job. But this wasn't the hospital calling about an emergency. This was Richard, calling from his private room, his voice weak but determined. "James, I need you to come in. Not as my doctor. As my friend." James was at the hospital within 20 minutes. He found Richard sitting up in bed, looking more alert than he had in weeks. On the bedside table was a manila envelope, sealed and addressed to James in Richard's careful handwriting. "Richard, are you okay? Are you in pain?" "I'm dying," Richard said matter-of-factly. "But that's not why I called you. I called you because I'm running out of time, and there are things I need you to know." James sat down in the chair beside the bed. "I'm listening." Richard picked up the envelope. "This contains everything I want you to know about Margaret, about our marriage, about why I've been pushing you two together. But I need you to promise me something first." "What?" "Promise me you won't open it until after my funeral. Promise me you'll let me die knowing that you're going to be there for Margaret, but not knowing what you're going to do about it." James stared at the envelope. "Richard, I don't understand." "You will. But right now, I need you to promise me that you'll take care of Margaret after I'm gone. Not just as her doctor, not just as her friend. I need you to promise me that you'll let yourself love her, and that you'll let her love you." James felt like he was drowning. "Richard, I can't promise that. I don't know how I feel about anything right now." "You love her," Richard said simply. "I can see it in the way you look at her, the way you talk about her, the way you've rearranged your entire life around her schedule. And she loves you. I can see it in the way she lights up when you walk into a room, the way she talks about you, the way she started living again instead of just existing. But she's your wife. She's my wife now. But in a few weeks, she's going to be a widow. And I need to know that she's not going to be alone." James took the envelope with shaking hands. "What's in here?" "The truth," Richard said. "About a lot of things. About how I found you, about why I chose you, about what I want for Margaret's future. About what I want for yours." "What do you mean, how you found me?" Richard smiled, but it was tired. "James, do you really think it's a coincidence that Margaret fell in love with the one man I trust completely? Do you think it's an accident that you're exactly the kind of person she needs?" James felt cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've been planning this for longer than you know. I'm saying that sometimes love needs a little help. And I'm saying that what's happening between you and Margaret isn't just fate, it's the result of a very deliberate choice on my part." "You orchestrated this?" "I orchestrated the opportunity. The feelings are real. The connection is real. The love is real. I just provided the circumstances." James stood up, pacing to the window. "Richard, this is insane. You can't manipulate people into falling in love." "I didn't manipulate anyone. I introduced two people who were perfect for each other, and then I got out of the way. Well, mostly out of the way." This is wrong. What's wrong is Margaret spending the rest of her life alone because she's too loyal to my memory to let herself be happy. What's wrong is you spending the rest of your life alone because you're too noble to admit that you've found the person you're supposed to be with. James turned back to Richard. How can you be okay with this? How can you want your wife to be with another man? Because I'm dying, and she's not. Because I love her enough to want her to be happy, even if it's not with me. Because I've seen what loneliness does to people, and I can't bear the thought of it happening to Margaret. Richard's voice was getting weaker, but his conviction was strong. James, I need you to understand something. I'm not giving up my wife. I'm not sharing her. I'm entrusting her to someone I know will love her the way she deserves to be loved. But what about you? What about your marriage? What about everything you've built together? Our marriage will always be part of who she is. I'm not asking her to forget me or pretend I never existed. I'm asking her to honor what we had by continuing to live. And I'm asking you to help her do that. James sank back into the chair. I don't know if I can do this. Yes, you can. Because you love her. And because she needs you. And because sometimes doing the right thing means doing the impossible thing. Richard reached for James's hand. There's something else I need to tell you. Something I've never told anyone, not even Margaret. What? You saved my life once. 25 years ago. You probably don't remember, but I do. I remember everything. James felt the world tilt. What are you talking about? You were a medical student. I was in a car accident on the interstate. You were the first responder, the one who kept me conscious until the paramedics arrived. You saved my life, and I never got to thank you. James's mind raced, trying to place the memory. 25 years ago, he would have been in his third year of medical school. He'd done rotations in emergency medicine, had been first on scene at several accidents. The businessman, he said slowly. The Mercedes that flipped on I-95. You were pinned under the dashboard. That was me. You were conscious the whole time. You kept asking about your wife, about whether someone had called Margaret. I just proposed to her the night before. I was driving to the jeweler to pick up her ring. I was so worried that if I died, she'd never know how much I loved her. James remembered now. The man had been calm despite his injuries, more concerned about his fiancée than his own pain. James had stayed with him, talking to him, keeping him focused until the paramedics could extract him from the wreckage. You gave me your word that night, Richard continued. You promised me that Margaret would be okay. You didn't even know who she was, but you promised me that someone would take care of her. James felt tears in his eyes. I remember. I've been looking for you ever since. I wanted to thank you, to repay the debt I owed you. When I got sick and started looking for the best oncologist in the city, I couldn't believe it when I saw your name. James Harrison, the same young man who saved my life. That's why you chose me as your doctor. That's why I trusted you with my life. And that's why I'm trusting you with hers. But Richard wasn't finished. His final request was the most difficult of all. He asked James to promise something that would test every principle the doctor held sacred. And if James refused, Richard would take a secret to his grave that would destroy the woman they both loved. Richard Whitmore died on a Tuesday morning in March, with Margaret holding one hand and James holding the other. At the funeral, 500 people mourned one of the city's most powerful men. But only James knew about the letter burning in his pocket, and only he understood that Richard's death was not an ending, but a beginning. The final weeks passed in a blur of medical interventions and quiet moments. Richard's body was shutting down, but his mind remained sharp. He spent his time putting his affairs in order, saying goodbye to friends and business associates, and watching Margaret and James navigate their complicated feelings. Margaret was struggling. The reality of losing Richard was hitting her in waves, and she felt guilty about every moment she spent thinking about James instead of focusing on her dying husband. She tried to maintain some distance from James, but Richard wouldn't let her. Don't you dare shut him out, Richard told her one afternoon when she'd declined James's invitation for coffee. Don't you dare let my dying make you forget how to live. Richard, I can't. It's not right. What's not right is wasting the time we have left worrying about what's appropriate. What's not right is punishing yourself for having feelings that make you human. Margaret started crying. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to grieve for you while having feelings for someone else. I don't know how to be a good wife to you while being whatever I am to James. You're being yourself, Richard said gently. You're being the woman I fell in love with, the one who's capable of tremendous love, even when it's complicated. Especially when it's complicated. The last conversation Richard had with James was 2 days before he died. Richard was barely conscious most of the time by then, but he managed to pull James aside when Margaret went to get lunch. The letter, Richard whispered. Promise me you'll read it all. Promise me you won't let guilt stop you from doing what's right. Richard, I promise I'll take care of her. That's not enough. Richard's grip on James's hand was surprisingly strong. Promise me you'll marry her. James felt like he'd been punched. What? Promise me you'll marry her. Promise me you'll give her the life she deserves. Promise me you'll make her happy. Richard, I can't promise that. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how she'll feel, how I'll feel. Promise me, Richard repeated, his voice urgent. Promise me, or I'll tell her the truth about why you really became my doctor. James felt cold. What truth? The truth about the accident. The truth about how I found you. The truth about how I've been planning this for years. If you don't promise me you'll marry her, I'll tell her that everything she's feeling is based on my manipulation. I'll destroy her faith in her own emotions. James stared at him. You wouldn't do that. I would if it meant protecting her from a lifetime of loneliness. I would if it meant making sure she doesn't spend the rest of her life second-guessing the best thing that's ever happened to her. James realized that Richard was serious. That he would actually hurt Margaret to ensure her future happiness. It was the most loving and most ruthless thing he'd ever encountered. Promise me, Richard said again. I promise, James whispered, not knowing if he was making a vow or signing his own death warrant. Richard died at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday. Margaret was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand in his. James was reviewing charts at the nurse's station when the alarms went off, but he already knew. He'd been expecting it for days. He found Margaret sitting beside Richard's body, not crying, just staring at their joined hands. He's gone, she said simply. I know. I thought I'd be more prepared. I thought I'd know what to do. James sat down beside her. There's no preparing for this. There's no right way to do it. Margaret looked at him. What happens now? James thought about the letter in his pocket, about the promise he'd made, about the impossible situation Richard had left them in. Now we take it one day at a time. The funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral. 500 people came to pay their respects to Richard Whitmore, business associates, politicians, charity board members, people whose lives he'd touched in ways both large and small. Margaret sat in the front row, composed and dignified, accepting condolences with grace. James sat in the back, feeling like an intruder. He was there as Richard's doctor, but he was also there as the man who was in love with the widow. The man who had promised to marry her. The man who was carrying a letter that would either justify everything or destroy it all. After the service, after the burial, after the reception where hundreds of people shared stories about Richard's generosity and vision, Margaret found James in the hospital parking lot. I don't know what to do with myself, she said. I don't know how to go home to an empty house. I don't know how to wake up tomorrow and not have someone to take care of. You don't have to figure it all out today, James said. Will you? Would you mind if I called you? Sometimes. Just to talk. James thought about the letter, about the promise, about the impossible complexity of their situation. Of course. But as Margaret walked to her car, James knew that everything was about to change. Because that night, he was going to read Richard's letter. And whatever was in it would determine the rest of both their lives. The letter contained 3 pages that would change everything. The first page was Richard's confession, that he had orchestrated their meeting, guided their friendship, and manipulated circumstances to bring them together. The second page was his blessing for their love. But the third page contained a revelation so shocking, it would rewrite the entire Whitmore family history. James wasn't just Margaret's husband's doctor. 25 years earlier, he had been the young medical student who saved Richard's life after a car accident. Richard had been searching for him ever since, wanting to repay the debt. When cancer gave him a deadline, he finally found his guardian angel, and realized he could give James the greatest gift of all, the woman Richard loved most in the world. James waited 3 days after the funeral before opening the letter. He kept it on his kitchen table, staring at it over coffee in the mornings, over dinner at night. Margaret called him twice during those 3 days, once to ask about Richard's medical records for the insurance company, once just to hear a familiar voice. On the third night, he finally broke the seal. My dear James, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Margaret is beginning the hardest chapter of her life. I'm hoping that by the time you finish this letter, you'll understand why I've done what I've done, and why I need you to do what I'm about to ask. First, let me tell you about the accident. Not the medical details. You remember those. Let me tell you about what it meant to me. I was 25 years old, on my way to pick up an engagement ring for the only woman I'd ever loved. I was so happy, James. I was thinking about our future, about the life we were going to build together, about the children we'd have and the adventures we'd share. When that truck ran the red light and my car flipped, my first thought wasn't about dying. It was about Margaret never knowing how much I loved her. It was about her spending the rest of her life wondering if I'd changed my mind about marrying her. It was about all the things I'd never get to tell her. And then you appeared. This young medical student who stayed with me, who kept me conscious, who promised me that Margaret would be okay. You didn't just save my life that day, James. You saved my future. You saved my love story. I never forgot your promise. I never forgot your face. And I never stopped looking for you. When I got sick and started researching oncologists, I couldn't believe it when I saw your name. Dr. James Harrison. The same age, the same background, the same face I'd never forgotten. It felt like fate. But then I met you again, and I realized something else. You weren't just the man who'd saved my life. You were the man who could save Margaret's. I know you think I manipulated the situation. I know you think I orchestrated your feelings for each other. But here's what you don't understand. I didn't create anything. I just recognized what was already there. You and Margaret are perfect for each other. You have the same values, the same compassion, the same capacity for love. You make each other better. You make each other happy. You make each other whole. I didn't manipulate that. I just provided the opportunity for it to happen. Which brings me to the second thing I need you to know. Margaret doesn't know about the accident. She doesn't know that you saved my life. She doesn't know that I've been looking for you. She doesn't know that I chose you as my doctor specifically because of our history. I never told her because I wanted her feelings for you to be pure. I wanted her to fall in love with you because of who you are, not because of what you did for me. And she has. She's fallen in love with your kindness, your intelligence, your dedication to helping others. She's fallen in love with the man you are, not the man you were to me. But there's more you need to know. James turned to the second page, his hands shaking. I've been planning this for longer than you know. Not just the two of you meeting, but your entire future together. I've made arrangements, James. Financial arrangements that will ensure you never have to worry about money again. I've endowed a foundation in your name that will support your research into palliative care. I've set up a trust that will fund your work for the rest of your career. Why? Because I want you to be able to choose love over obligation. I want you to be able to marry Margaret because you want to, not because you need to. I want you to be able to provide for her not because you have to, but because you can. I know you're thinking that this is all too much, that you can't accept it. But James, this isn't charity. This is payment of a debt. 25 years ago, you saved my life. Now I'm trying to save yours. And Margaret's. Which brings me to the third thing you need to know. James turned to the final page, and what he read there made him sink into a chair. James, Margaret can't have children. We tried for years, spent tens of thousands of dollars on treatments, consulted with specialists all over the world. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with either of us, but it just never happened. It broke her heart. She blamed herself, even though I told her 1,000 times that it wasn't her fault. She poured all her maternal instincts into her charity work, into helping other people's children, but I could see the sadness in her eyes sometimes. A year ago, before I got sick, she told me she'd made peace with it. She said she'd accepted that we weren't meant to be parents. But I know her better than that. I know she still wonders what it would have been like. James, I need you to know that Margaret would be an incredible mother. I need you to know that if you two decide to have children, through adoption, through surrogacy, through whatever means, she would love those children with every fiber of her being. I need you to know that because I think you might be the person who can heal that part of her heart that's been broken for so long. I'm not asking you to have children with her. I'm not asking you to fix her. I'm just asking you to know that she has so much love to give, and if you're willing to receive it, she'll give it all to you. Now, my final request. I need you to marry her, James. Not someday, not eventually, but soon. I need you to marry her within a year of my death. Why? Because I know Margaret. I know she'll spend months, maybe years, feeling guilty about her feelings for you. She'll convince herself that she needs to grieve longer, that she needs to be more respectful of my memory. She'll find 1,000 reasons to deny herself happiness. Don't let her do that. Don't let her waste years of her life feeling guilty about love. I'm giving you permission, James. I'm giving you my blessing. I'm giving you my wife. Love her the way she deserves to be loved. Protect her the way she deserves to be protected. Make her happy the way she deserves to be happy. And when you do, remember that you're not taking her away from me. You're continuing the love story I started. With all my gratitude and respect, Richard. P.S. The ring is in the safe in my study. Margaret knows the combination. It was my mother's engagement ring, and it's been in the Whitmore family for 3 generations. Margaret deserves to wear it again. James read the letter 3 times, then sat in his kitchen until sunrise, trying to process what Richard had done. The man had orchestrated not just their meeting, but their entire future. He'd planned for their love, their marriage, their financial security, even their potential children. It was the most romantic and most manipulative thing James had ever encountered. And it was absolutely, completely, perfectly like Richard Whitmore to plan every detail of his own death to ensure his wife's happiness. The question was, what was James going to do about it? But the letter had one final twist. Richard had left specific instructions for his funeral, his will, and his wife's future. And he'd made one request that would test whether Margaret and James's love was strong enough to survive the truth about how it began. For 8 months, Margaret and James struggled with their feelings, their guilt, and the ghost of Richard's orchestration. They tried to stay apart, tried to deny what they felt, tried to honor Richard's memory by refusing his gift. But love, real love, doesn't follow anyone's plan, not even a dead man's. James called Margaret the morning after he read the letter. I need to see you, he said. Is everything okay? I need to show you something. Something from Richard. They met at the hospital cafeteria, the same place where they'd had their first real conversation. Margaret looked tired. James knew she hadn't been sleeping well since the funeral. What is it? She asked. James pulled out the letter. Richard left this for me. He asked me not to open it until after the funeral. Margaret stared at the pages. What does it say? It says a lot of things. But mostly, it says that he wants us to be together. Margaret's face went pale. What do you mean? James told her everything. About the accident 25 years ago, about Richard's search for him, about the deliberate choice to make James his doctor. He told her about Richard's plans for their future, about the financial arrangements, about the foundation and the trust. And he told her about Richard's final request, that they marry within a year. Margaret listened in silence, her face cycling through shock, confusion, and finally, something that looked like betrayal. He planned all of this, she said finally. He planned the opportunity. He didn't plan our feelings. But he manipulated us. He used his illness to push us together. Yes. He made us feel guilty about our feelings so we'd get closer to each other. Yes. Margaret stood up abruptly. I need to think about this. Margaret. No, James. I need time to process this. I need to figure out what's real and what's Richard's manipulation. She left, and James didn't see her for 2 weeks. When she finally called, her voice was different. Harder. I've been thinking about everything you told me, she said. And I've realized something. What? I don't know if my feelings for you are real or if they're just the result of Richard's planning. I don't know if what we have is genuine or if it's just a very elaborate psychological manipulation. James felt his heart sink. Margaret, what we feel for each other is real. It doesn't matter how it started. But it does matter. It matters because I need to know that if I'm going to love someone, it's because I chose to, not because my dead husband arranged it. So what are you saying? I'm saying I need space. I need time to figure out who I am without Richard, and without you. I need to know that whatever I feel is mine, not his. James understood, but that didn't make it hurt less. How much time? I don't know. Maybe a lot. Maybe forever. They didn't speak for 3 months. James threw himself into his work, but he couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. He couldn't stop wondering if she was okay, if she was happy, if she was thinking about him. Margaret, meanwhile, was struggling with her own demons. She'd moved out of the house she'd shared with Richard, buying a small apartment across town. She'd started volunteering at the animal shelter again, working with abandoned dogs. She'd even started painting again, watercolors of landscapes that seemed to capture her emotional state, lonely, beautiful, and somehow hopeful. But she couldn't stop thinking about James. She couldn't stop missing their conversations, their walks, their quiet moments together. She couldn't stop wondering if what she'd felt for him was real or just Richard's manipulation. The breakthrough came when she was working with a particularly difficult dog at the shelter. He was a German Shepherd mix who'd been abused and abandoned, and he wouldn't let anyone get close to him. Margaret spent weeks sitting with him, reading to him, just being present until he started to trust her. You know what's funny, she said to the dog one day. I'm worried about whether my feelings are real or manipulated, but here you are, learning to trust again even though humans have hurt you. You're not worried about whether your feelings are pure or complicated. You're just feeling them. The dog looked at her with those wise, sad eyes, and Margaret realized something. Love wasn't about perfect circumstances or pure beginnings. Love was about choice. It was about deciding to care for someone despite the complications, despite the uncertainty, despite the fear. She called James that night. I've been thinking about everything, she said. And I realized that I don't care how it started. I don't care if Richard manipulated us or if fate brought us together or if it was all just a cosmic coincidence. What I care about is how I feel about you. James felt hope bloom in his chest. How do you feel about me? I love you. I'm in love with you. I want to be with you. And I'm tired of letting guilt and fear keep me from being happy. Margaret. But I need you to know something. If we do this, if we're together, I need it to be our choice. Not Richard's plan, not his dying wish, not his manipulation. Our choice. It is our choice. Then choose me, James. Not because Richard asked you to, not because you promised him, not because you feel obligated. Choose me because you want to. I choose you, James said without hesitation. I choose you because I love you. I choose you because you make me better. I choose you because I can't imagine my life without you. Margaret started crying. I choose you too. Which brings us back to that altar, that designer gown, and the moment when Margaret chose truth over tradition. Standing before 300 guests, she didn't just marry James Harrison. She revealed Richard's letter, read his words aloud, and showed the world that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage is accepting a gift you never asked for. The wedding was supposed to be small. Margaret and James had planned a simple ceremony with just close friends and family. But word got out, and before they knew it, they were planning a wedding for 300 people. Margaret wore a dress that cost more than most people's cars, but she didn't care about the price tag. She cared about the symbolism. She was starting a new life, and she wanted to look like someone who was ready for new beginnings. James wore a tuxedo that Richard had actually picked out for him months before his death. Margaret had found it in Richard's closet with a note. For James to wear when he marries Margaret. Make sure it fits properly. Even in death, Richard was still planning their lives. The ceremony was held at the same cathedral where Richard's funeral had taken place. Margaret had chosen it deliberately. She wanted to face the ghost of her first marriage head-on. As she walked down the aisle, Margaret saw familiar faces in the crowd. Richard's business associates, their friends, people who had known them as a couple. She wondered what they were thinking, whether they approved, whether they thought she was moving on too quickly. But when she reached the altar and looked into James's eyes, all of that faded away. This was right. This was real. This was her choice. The ceremony proceeded normally until it came time for the vows. The officiant asked Margaret to speak first, and she stepped forward with a piece of paper in her hand. James, she began, I want to start by reading you something. She unfolded the paper, and James realized it was Richard's letter. This is from Richard, she announced to the crowd, and a murmur went through the church. He wrote this to James before he died, and I think it's important that everyone understand how we got here. Margaret began to read. My dear James, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Margaret is beginning the hardest chapter of her life. I'm hoping that by the time you finish this letter, you'll understand why I've done what I've done, and why I need you to do what I'm about to ask. She continued reading, sharing the story of the accident, Richard's search, his deliberate choice of James as his doctor. She read about his plans for their future, his financial arrangements, his blessing for their love. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. I wanted you all to know this, Margaret said, because I want you to understand that this isn't about replacing Richard or forgetting him. This is about honoring him by accepting the gift he gave us. She turned to James. Richard brought us together, but he didn't make us fall in love. He didn't make us choose each other. He didn't make us decide to build a life together. Those were our choices. Margaret folded the letter and took James's hands. James Harrison, I love you not because my first husband asked me to, but because you're kind and compassionate and because you make me want to be better than I am. I love you because you've seen me at my worst and you still think I'm worth loving. I love you because you've taught me that it's possible to honor the past while embracing the future. She paused, looking out at the congregation. Richard was right about one thing. Love isn't diminished by complicated beginnings. Love isn't weakened by being planned or guided or even manipulated by someone who cares about your happiness. Love is strengthened by being tested, by surviving truth, by choosing each other again and again. Margaret looked back at James. I choose you, James. Not because Richard asked me to, but because I want to. I choose you because I love you. I choose you because I can't imagine my life without you. James was crying now, not caring who saw. Margaret, I choose you too. I choose you because you're the strongest person I know. I choose you because you've taught me that love isn't about perfect circumstances. It's about imperfect people choosing to love each other anyway. The rest of the ceremony was a blur. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the entire congregation erupted in applause. It wasn't just approval, it was celebration. It was joy. It was the recognition that they'd witnessed something extraordinary. That wedding was 3 years ago. Today, Margaret and James run the Whitmore Foundation, helping terminal patients and their families navigate the impossible journey of letting go. They've turned Richard's final gift into a legacy that touches thousands of lives. But here's what they learned, and what I want you to remember. Love isn't diminished by being planned, guided, or even manipulated by someone who cares about your happiness. True love survives the truth about how it began, and grows stronger when it's tested by impossible circumstances. Last month, Margaret and James celebrated their 3rd wedding anniversary. They spent it the same way they spend every March 15th, the anniversary of Richard's death. They visit his grave, they tell him about their year, and they thank him for bringing them together. The Whitmore Foundation has grown into one of the largest palliative care organizations in the country. They've helped thousands of families navigate terminal illness, and they've trained hundreds of doctors and nurses in compassionate end-of-life care. But the most important thing they've done is prove that Richard was right. Love can survive complicated beginnings. Love can grow stronger when it's tested by impossible circumstances. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is giving someone permission to love again. Margaret never did have children of her own, but she's become a mother figure to dozens of young patients and their families. She's the person they call when they need someone to talk to, someone to hold their hand, someone to remind them that they're not alone. James has become one of the most respected palliative care physicians in the country. He's written books about end-of-life care, and he's trained a generation of doctors to see death not as failure, but as a natural part of life that can be navigated with dignity and grace. Together, they've created something beautiful from something tragic. They've built a life that honors Richard's memory while being completely their own. And every day, they choose each other again. Not because Richard asked them to, but because they want to. Not because they're obligated to, but because they can't imagine doing anything else. If this story made you think differently about love, loss, or second chances, I want you to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes we all need to be reminded that it's possible to honor the past while embracing the future. What would you do in Margaret's position? Could you accept a love that was orchestrated by fate, or by the person you thought you'd lost forever? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories that will challenge everything you think you know about love, make sure you subscribe. Next week, I'm telling you about a woman who discovered her husband's secret fortune on the same day she decided to leave him. Thank you so much for watching. Please support this channel by sharing this video and watch our other beautiful stories. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell.